I'm pretty confident that most of you already know who number 1 on this list is. So today we're ranking each NHL playoff team in 2023 by how badly they need to end their Stanley Cup drought. Of course, this is just my list. I want to know yours in the comments down below. Give me your top 5 and stick around for more coverage of the NHL playoffs in the form of videos like this and live streams. I've got a big giveaway to announce pretty soon, so you won't want to miss that. So in total, I have 20 teams because some teams are still vying for playoff spots and some teams will actually miss the playoffs. But we'll kick things off at number 20 with the Seattle Kraken. They've never won the Stanley Cup. It's only their second season in the NHL, and it's great that they're just making the playoffs this early into their franchise. So I don't think the fans are expecting anything miraculous from them this year necessarily. So that's why they're in 20th. In 19th, I've got the Colorado Avalanche, if you even want to call it a Stanley Cup drought, because they won the Cup last season. And the best players on this roster have many, many great years of hockey ahead of them. So we're talking about Cale Makar. He's not even in the prime of his career. Nathan MacKinnon, Mikko Rantanen, you can even extend this to Devon Toews, or even Gabriel Landeskog has plenty of great hockey in him. But I do think the fans expect at least some sort of a deep run this year and maybe challenging for a Stanley Cup over the next few seasons. You also have to consider that Denver sports teams haven't been the best over the last, 7 or 8 years. So it'd be great to see the Avalanche win another Stanley Cup. But even so, they got what they wanted last season, and there's more to build on in the next few years. In 18th, I had the Tampa Bay Lightning. Of course, they won the Cup in 2020 and 2021. It's kind of like Colorado, right? Can they get one more out of this core? The core for Tampa is a little bit older, but still, they have many great years ahead of them. It's going to be more of a matter of how they manage their salary cap situation going forward. I think it's going to be a little more challenging than the Avs, but even so, despite having to face maybe the Boston Bruins in the playoffs this year, this team could still be competitive for the next couple of seasons with the likes of Nikita Kucherov, Steven Stamkos, Andrei Vasilevsky in goal, Victor Hedman on defense, Braden Point, the list goes on. In 17th, I have the LA Kings. They last won the Cup in 2014, and in 2012, they still have Drew Doughty and Anze Kopitar as part of their roster right now. So can they get one more Stanley Cup with them in the mix? Even so, even if they don't do all that well this year, they still are kind of ahead of schedule because some of their best players are in their prospect pool. So they could have a great core going forward, even when Doughty and Kopitar are in the twilight of their careers. And you also have to consider how other LA teams have performed in recent years. The Dodgers won a World Series and went to a couple other ones. The Rams won a Super Bowl. The Lakers won a championship as well. I know, put an asterisk next to them. But even so, LA's had it pretty damn good for the last few years, and the Kings only needed 3 years to rebuild their roster. That's very impressive. In 16th, I've got the New Jersey Devils. They last won the Stanley Cup in 2003. The last decade has not been kind to them. They've only made the playoffs just once, but this team has such a bright future ahead of it. They completely overshot our expectations this year, going from kind of the basement of the NHL to toward the top. So while they might not necessarily be expected to make a deep run this year particularly, I think they've got a lot of great years ahead of them. So I wouldn't be as concerned about them just yet. In 15th, I have the Buffalo Sabres. I don't expect them to make the playoffs, but I wanted to include them here. They've never won a Stanley Cup. They've been around since 1970. And when you think of those passionate Buffalo sports fans, right, the Bills have never won a Super Bowl. They've endured plenty of heartache. That fan base certainly has. The future for the Sabres is very bright, right? They have lots of great young players on the roster right now and in their prospect pool. I've seen it ranked as high as number 1 over the past several months. And I think that Sabres fans would just be happy for their team to be in the playoffs. They wouldn't expect them to really do any damage out there with some of the big heavy hitters in the Eastern Conference. In 14th, I have the Vegas Golden Knights. They don't have a Stanley Cup just yet, but they're just in their 6th season in the NHL. And as great of a season as they're having this year, and normally you would expect a team like that to make a deep run, to maybe contend for a Stanley Cup, they're doing this without Mark Stone. Jack Eichel has lots of great years ahead of him, and so if he combined with a healthy Stone and some other veterans out there with good hockey left in them, could that group actually contend for a Stanley Cup over the next couple of years? Let's assume that maybe Logan Thompson gets better, Shea Theodore only continues getting better as well. Then who knows, maybe things could actually get even better for the Golden Knights, but for now, they're not necessarily expected to be a world beater in the Western Conference in the playoffs. In 13th, I've got the Winnipeg Jets. Now, the Jets have never made a Stanley Cup final, but the thing is that they haven't always been a Cup favorite. That happens pretty rarely from my observations. The thing, though, with Winnipeg is, first of all, they're a Canadian team, so there's always going to be some more pressure there and higher expectations. And second of all, it's really about that core of players, right? Blake Wheeler is clearly the oldest in this group, but they've got Mark Scheifele, Kyle Connor, Nikolai Ehlers, and they've got Connor Hellebuck as well at the top of his game. So can they contend for a Stanley Cup with this core, or do they need to consider some sort of a rebuild? They're on the fringe of the playoff picture this year. Rick Bowness got the Dallas Stars to the Stanley Cup as the interim head coach in 2020. Could he do something like that with these Jets? I'm not entirely sure. But then again, the Stars were being counted out pretty early on in the playoffs when he was behind the bench there. In 12th, I have the Nashville Predators. Now, they've never won a Stanley Cup. They've gone to a final in 2017. With the group they have this year, I wouldn't expect them to do any sort of damage. Then again, Nashville has done a lot of damage in the playoffs as a lower seed, but when you look at this roster, considering the injuries to all their top line players, Forsberg, Johansson, Yossi's been out a little bit. I'm thinking of Duchesne as well, right? How could they possibly upset a team like the Avalanche or the Golden Knights in the first round? Stranger things have happened, but I don't think the fans are expecting that. However, they had so many good runs over the last, 12, 15 years or so, just getting into the playoffs and taking series deep, that I would think the fans are kind of getting restless. They might want to just tear things down entirely, although they've found ways to stay competitive this whole time. So what's it going to be with the Predators going forward? Of course, Barry Trotz, the new general manager, is going to have a lot of big decisions ahead of him. In 11th, I've got the Carolina Hurricanes. They last won the Stanley Cup in 2006, and they've been really building something special over the past few seasons with Rod Brind'Amour. So is the culmination of that a Stanley Cup here in 2023? They, of course, would have to do that without Andrei Svechnikov and Max Pacioretty. But even so, with that core of players, with Aho, Teravainen, with Kotkaniemi excelling in the second half, with, of course, their defensive core of Slavin, they brought in Burns, they've got Pesce, Shea, right? They should be expecting themselves to make a deep run this year and possibly get to the Stanley Cup final. The field of competition will be incredibly competitive in the East, but I think that pressure should start ratcheting up a little bit. You also have to think that the Hurricanes are the best shot for a team in North Carolina to win a championship, at least among pro sports. We'll throw college basketball out the window here because the Charlotte Hornets have been bad forever. And the other team is the Carolina Panthers, and man, they've been awful for the past couple of seasons as well. In 10th, I have the Pittsburgh Penguins. They've won 3 with Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin, but kind of like I was talking about earlier with the LA Kings, can they get one more with this core of players? They've been just constantly trying to refill that roster instead of rebuilding. They've acquired players like Mikael Granlund. They got Rickard Rakell last season, right? So they added some big names, and that hasn't really translated into postseason success over the past few seasons. In fact, they haven't won a playoff series since 2018, and they've been to the postseason every time since. So they're in a bit of a tough situation there. It hasn't been easy for other professional sports teams in Pittsburgh. The Pirates have been bad pretty much my whole lifetime, and the Steelers are a far cry from where they were a few years ago with Big Ben at the helm. In 9th, I have the Florida Panthers, another team that's battling for a wild card spot. They've never won a Stanley Cup. They went to the final back in 1996, and ever since then, they've won 1 playoff series. That came last year when the team had the best record in the NHL, and they only went to the second round and lost to Tampa Bay. And when you think of the Panthers, right, they seem night and day from what they were last season, an offensive juggernaut. And they don't have a first-round pick until 2026. So really, I unfortunately think the writing is on the wall for the Florida Panthers to have to go back to the well and kind of rebuild their team. But the fans, they have to be chomping at the bit for this team to get one while they have Barkov doing his thing, while they brought in Matthew Tkachuk. And even though the Heat brought a couple of titles to Miami and the Dolphins are finally good again, I still think that maybe last year's Panthers team was the best Miami sports team in about a decade, since LeBron was there with the Heat. In 8th, I have the Minnesota Wild. They've never won a Stanley Cup, and they've never been to a final. They've just been to a conference final. They've been around for 23 years. Now, with the Wild, you got to just tie this back to Minnesota sports. Of course, I talk about this all the time, right? MLB, MLS, NBA, NFL, no titles in the Twin Cities since 1991. And for the fans out there, whether we're talking about the Minnesota Twins seemingly just getting obliterated by the Yankees every time they're in the postseason, or the other side of the coin with the Minnesota Vikings and their epic chokes and collapses in the playoffs, I'm a fan of them, by the way. I would think the Wild would have the best chance of winning a championship. However, the future does look kind of brighter, right? Matt Boldy is already a star in the NHL. Kirill Kaprizov has many, many great years ahead of him. You think of the goaltending situation with Philip Gustafsson, only 25 years old, and they also have Jesper Wallstedt waiting in the wings. So things could get even better for the Wild, but even so, this team hasn't made a deep run in 20 years. In 7th, this might be a bit of a hot take, I have the Dallas Stars. They last won the Stanley Cup in 1999, of course went to the final in 2020. The reason why I have them this high is because they've had Tyler Seguin and Jamie Benn on this roster for a long time. They've gotten so close to winning a Stanley Cup. They've brought in even more veterans in the likes of Joe Pavelski and Ryan Suter, who have been to Stanley Cup finals or at least on deep runs. They brought in Peter DeBoer, his first year with a team. He's always doing an amazing job with that, whether it's in Vegas, whether it's in New Jersey or San Jose. So really, to me, a lot of those pieces should be fitting together for the Dallas Stars. I picked them, I think, to go to the conference final this year. So I did have high expectations myself. And I think that Dallas sports fans should have high expectations. The Mavericks have had a terrible down year after going to their conference final last year. The Cowboys are a f***ing tease. And you look at the other team, that's the Texas Rangers. If you want to talk about postseason heartbreak, they are the epitome of that. So the Dallas Stars have more pressure than I think people are realizing. In 6th, we've got the New York Islanders. They last won the Stanley Cup in 1983. They went to the final the next year, losing to Gretzky and the Oilers, but they haven't been back to the Stanley Cup final since. That's 39 years. Now with the Islanders, I just never know what direction this team is going in. They have, fourth liners signed to 4 3-year deals. They've mortgaged a little bit of their future by trading away Aatu Räty and also, first round draft picks in exchange for Bo Horvat. It's worked out decently, but even so, it's just for that team to scratch and claw their way into the postseason. So, this Islanders team, veteran-led, right? But other than Sorokin, are there any other real superstars who are going to take the team on their back on a deep playoff run, especially if they have to go up against the Boston Bruins in the first round? Personally, I just don't see that happening. In 5th, I have the Calgary Flames. They last won the Stanley Cup back in 1989, and right now they are scratching and clawing to just stay alive in the playoff picture. With them, it's kind of like the Florida Panthers, right? The Flames had a couple of amazing seasons in recent years, and you look at the offseason, sure, they lost Gaudreau and they lost Tkachuk, but they bring in Huberdeau and sign him long-term. They bring in Nazem Kadri and sign him long-term. They also sign Mackenzie Weegar to a fairly long deal, and they have a proven coach in Daryl Sutter who has won 2 Stanley Cups in unprecedented fashion with the LA Kings. I actually predicted the Flames to win the Stanley Cup this year, and I think most people out there expected them to be at the top of this division. I didn't even mention Jacob Markstrom, who was a Vezina finalist last season. So this team should be able to go on a deep run. This team should be able to dominate, but they haven't been to a conference final in quite some time. So I think Flames fans are getting a little bit tired. They're seeing what that other team in Alberta is kind of building over the last few years. And so for them, it's kind of like now or never. And that other Alberta team, the Edmonton Oilers, are 4th on my list. They last won the Stanley Cup in 1990. So this is pretty simple, right? You've got the prime of Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, maybe the 2 best players on the planet or the 2 best forwards. So this is their opportunity. They went to the conference final last year. Yes, they got swept by the Avalanche, but McDavid and Draisaitl put the team on their backs. They got some good contributions from players like Zach Hyman and Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. The defense and the goaltending has been a little bit stronger down the stretch, so they'll probably go into the playoffs on quite a streak. They might even win the Pacific Division. So I think that certainly places some expectations on the Oilers, and really it's all about what can McDavid and Draisaitl do following in the footsteps of Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier. In 3rd, I have the Boston Bruins. They last won the Stanley Cup back in 2011. They went to 2 other finals since then, but I have them this high because this might be the last dance, right? The last chance for Patrice Bergeron to win a cup, for David Krejci to win a cup. So they have those veterans. Marchand is getting a little bit older as well, despite them having some good future Hall of Famers like McAvoy and Pasternak. But really, the Bruins, a record-setting year, right? They might have 63 or 64 wins at the end of this year. So this team is expected to win the Stanley Cup this year, just flat out, right? There's almost no excuse. And very often history is rewritten. So if the Bruins were to win the Stanley Cup this year, the exclamation point on this incredible historic season, we'd be looking back at them and say, well, shoot, they should have won more Stanley Cups. So it's almost like this team is going to kind of make up for their performances in the past, as terrific as they've been. You also have to think about what other Boston teams have done over a 15 or 20 year period. I'm talking about the Patriots, and I'm talking about the Red Sox. In 2nd, I have the New York Rangers. Now, they last won the Stanley Cup back in 1994, but check this out. That was their only Stanley Cup in an 83-year period, so 1 cup since 1940. Now, certainly Igor Shesterkin, Adam Fox, Ryan Lindgren, those guys are going to be great. So is the kid line for a number of years. But the thing is, the Rangers went all in at the trade deadline, adding to their veteran top 6 with Patrick Kane, and Vladimir Tarasenko. This is a tremendous opportunity for them. This might be their best shot to win a Stanley Cup. And you also have to think about that very intense New York sports market. They expect championships, right? Ever since the Giants won the Super Bowl back in 2012, there has not been a championship among New York teams. Maybe the baseball teams could compete for a World Series this year, of course, buying their way to success. I left out New York City FC winning a title, but outside of that, the Knicks are the Knicks, the Nets are the Nets, so are the Jets, and you've got the New York Giants as well. So it's really the New York Rangers' best opportunity for talking about salary cap teams. And in first, to no surprise, it's the Toronto Maple Leafs. They last won the Stanley Cup back in 1967. Back then, that was the end of the original 6 era. So ever since the NHL expanded to 12 teams, the Leafs not only haven't won a Stanley Cup, they haven't been to a Stanley Cup final. And they haven't won a playoff round since 2004. We're going to, of course, talk about how many times the Leafs have melted down in recent years in the postseason. It's got to be this year. No excuses. They have to make at least a deep run. They have to get through Boston to do it. And if they don't do it, all we're going to hear about next year is where is Austin Matthews going to sign in 2024. But what does your top 5 look like? Comment down below and see the pinned comment for what to watch next. And guys, if you want more content on top of what I give you already, tap that join button down below. Become a member. I need more paying members if I'm going to make it as a full-time content creator on YouTube. So support the dream. Tap join below. Become a member. You'll get more of what you love. And by the way, before you go, leave a thumbs up, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I'll catch you later for more coverage of the Stanley Cup playoffs in 2023. Thank you so much for tuning in. Once again, I'm Nick, and I'll catch you Twisters later. Ciao.